Well, I'd like to welcome everybody to this second brown bag of our brown bag series for academic year 22-23. I'm Jamie Goodrich, the director of the Humanities Center. And today we are lucky enough to have a presentation by Professor Muhammad al-Sharkawi, who is an associate professor of Arabic at the Department of Classical and Modern Language, Literatures and Cultures here at Wayne State. He's been here since 2011. Before that, he taught Arabic at Bayreuth University in Germany, the American University in Cairo, and Brown University. And he has published 7 translations from English into Arabic of introductions to linguistics and its subfields. His main field of research is the history and development of the Arabic language. He has also published numerous articles in Encyclopedia Lemmas on the subject, as well as 5 books on the history of Arabic. In 2007, he published the Arabicization of the Middle East, an introduction in Arabic. A second edition of this book is now in press. And in 2010, he published with Brill, The Ecology of Arabic. And so I'd like to welcome him today for his talk entitled Emergence of Classical Arabic, a Case for Language Contact. And I'll let him take it away.
Thank you, Jamie. It's an honor to be here, and it's an honor to talk about this topic because this is the general theme of my next manuscript. A lot of us in the field of languages in general, and especially history of languages, are acquainted with Arabic one way or another, especially if the researcher is interested in Semitic languages. The Arabic language has been always considered one of the main and the oldest Semitic languages, especially in its classical form, what we call classical Arabic, and that's the language of the Qur'an and a huge body of pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry. So I would like to start with a very quick introduction into what I am going to try to be showing here, and then follow that up with the current status and take it from there. What I'm trying to show in this lecture is to give you a general idea or a bird's eye view of the result of 6 or 7 years of research into the different individual structures of the classical Arabic language. And the general notion that I came up with is that, in fact, classical Arabic is not an ancient Semitic language. It is a variety that came to existence only as early as the 4th century of the Islamic era, which is the 10th century of the Common Era, and with the standardization of the classical Arabic. And with that, it puts in question all the previous notions about Arabic that I will begin to talk about in a second. But the emergence of this classical Arabic variety or form came by means of contact between various pre-existing dialects of Semitic dialects, and coexistence or contact between these Semitic dialects and other Semitic languages from different Semitic branches, especially the Ethiopic and ancient South Arabian languages. So it, in fact, is or can be considered the most recent of the major Semitic languages. Now, the current understanding in the field is that the Arabic language as a whole is understood or looked at through a diglossic lens. A diglossic framework means that there is more than one variety of the language with functional distribution, meaning that a particular variety serves in particular socio-communicative functions and cannot serve in other functions. So the functions are mutually exclusive. In addition, one variety will be considered a higher variety, enjoying prestige, and other varieties will be considered functional varieties and do not enjoy prestige. So the distribution is functional, and the prestige is the function of the high variety. The language of the Quran and of pre-Islamic poetry is dubbed generally in the field as classical Arabic. And of course, that is a remnant from, or a reflection of, the Indo-European origin of the field of historical linguistics. But I'll use that term for now. We do not need to debate it. That form, or that variety, in the 19th century for socio-political and social mobility reasons developed into modern Standard Arabic, yet the diglossic situation remains the understanding of scholars in the field. Modern Standard Arabic differs from classical Arabic on a lexical level in most of the cases. However, structurally speaking, there are no remarkable differences. Before the standardization period that began in the 4th, 11th century, that variety can be dubbed as a pre-classical Arabic. Pre-classical means it enjoyed a lot of structural variation and functional fluidity. That's the only difference between pre-classical and classical Arabic. Standardization is what shifted this from a pre-classical form into its pre-classical variety. And I'm here today to particularly or partially challenge that understanding. That understanding is based on the notion that classical Arabic was used by the Arabs before the emergence of Islam and at the time of the tenure of the Prophet Muhammad in the 7th century of the Common Era. And the common understanding has it that this variety must have either been used by Bedouin Arabs in Eastern and Central Arabia, which is the part of the Arabian Peninsula you see here colored in yellow. And other scholars in the Germanic, especially in the Germanic tradition of Semitic linguistics, focus the use of pre-classical Arabic into Northeast Arabia, Northern and Northeast Arabia. However, the Arab grammarians themselves, whose tradition began in the 8th century of the Common Era, 2nd century of the Islamic era, have not talked about this form as a dialect, as a spoken language, but they considered it to be the language of the Arabs. It is only, and that's the understanding that all the Arab scholars and all the Western scholars seem to have adopted without critical analysis. Interestingly, earlier this year, Van Putten published his analysis of the Quranic text, the Quranic script, the script used to record the Quran in writing between the middle of the 1st century and the middle of the 2nd century, to state that, in fact, this variety may have been spoken in the Hijaz region, which you see on your left-hand side shaded in green on the map, and the city of Mecca with a dot towards the south of this region. In fact, although Van Putten seems to have understood the Quranic script very well, but he overgeneralized his understanding. I agree that the script of the Quran we have now reflects a Hijazi pronunciation, but I disagree with his generalization that it is a reflection that the Arabic of the Quran was indeed the language spoken in Hijaz. In addition to that, no scholar from the beginning of the 20th century has managed to convincingly show that classical Arabic was a spoken variety on the one hand, and even less that it was used by any particular geographical or tribal area in the early Islamic period. Finally, textually speaking, in the first 3 to 4 centuries of the Islamic era, there was no textual or anecdotal reference that it was a spoken variety. In the last 6 or 7 years, I have been reading and going through 2 types of material. First, the structural analysis of Arabic between the 2nd and the 5th century of the Islamic era, the 8th and the 11th century of the Common Era. That's one source. And the second source is the tradition of commonplace books that emerged in the 3rd century of the Common Era. Commonplace books in Arabic are encyclopedic volumes of books in which a particular author writes about a random facts, remarks, or discussions about a particular topic. And these books usually contained, directed towards animals, sticks, canes, all kinds of birds, dogs, differences between Arabs and non-Arabs, the features and descriptions of the Turks, the features and descriptions of the Romans, books like that, which contain, in fact, a lot of wealthy material on the popular and scholarly attitudes of the day. In addition to that, the Arabs between the 3rd and the 5th centuries as well have produced a spectacular, I would say, amount of recorded transcribed duels, scholarly duels, in which a particular author writes the discussion and a debate on a particular scholarly field, and this is generally called the literature of Majaz. So in the last 6 or 7 years, I have looked into these and came up with a particular understanding that classical Arabic was not a spoken variety that can be ascribed to a particular geographical or social group. And it started to emerge as late as the 4th century of the Islamic era. And that emergence is not even, meaning the standardization of the sounds of quote-unquote classical Arabic was earlier than the standardization of its morphosyntactic features. Also, the emergence of this classical or pre-classical form into classical form was made possible by the presence of the Qur'an, and I will explain that why. But before I do that, I would like to dismiss the notion that Arabs assumed that the language of the Quran and pre-Islamic poetry was a high variety in a diglossic form, and spoken Arabic of the Arabs of the time was a low variety. So I would like here to start by dismissing that false notion. And to do that, I resorted to the first introduction to Arabic linguistics that was written in the middle of the 4th century. And this book is called Sahibi by a scholar of Arabic of Persian descent, Ibn Faris. And Ibn Faris in this book starts by introducing that the best language is the language of the Quran. And that is a literal translation. Best language is the language of the Quran, Kalam al-Quran. And the word Kalam, interestingly, during the times of Ibn Faris, does not mean what it means to us in the 19th, 20th, and 21st centuries right now. Kalam to the Arabs of the 3rd and 4th centuries meant discourse. And Ibn Faris, when he talked about this kind of discourse, meant that the language or the forms used in the framing of the Quran is, quote unquote, the best. And he also said that the speech of the Arabs, all the Arabs, and the language with which pre-Islamic poetry was written cannot be on the same level as the Quran. And of course, his understanding comes from belief, meaning that his reasoning is that the Quran is the word of God, literal word of God. So and then he organized this word of God as the top level, followed by the language of poetry, and then on the bottom, how the Arabs spoke or discoursed. The text that Ibn Faris gives us, in fact, is an understanding of his feeling and the feeling that was current during his time, that the Quran as a text was the best form and not the best language. There is nothing in this, in Ibn Faris's Arabic, that discusses the language of the Quran itself being the best, but the discourse of the Quran. And second to that comes pre-Islamic poetry. Okay, and now I will discuss the prestige aspect. I'm going to dismiss here that there was a prestige assigned to a particular linguistic form, which is the second leg of a diglossic situation. In the commonplace books and in the books of Majalis that I just spoke about a few minutes ago, we see in this particular quote here, Al-Jahid in the 3rd century writes about different kinds of animals and differences between animals and human beings, stating that, in fact, human beings, he says, are al-fasih. And in our modern times, we understand the linguistic prestige of classical and modern standard Arabic as fasih. That's the adjective we use to describe that language, fasih. But in the 3rd century, fasih meant expressive, able to express oneself. And he goes on to say, and this is the part marked in red, on the first part marked in red in Arabic, and it's transliterated and translated down below. The first one says, Al-Fasih huwa al-insan. So human beings all human beings are expressive. And he goes on to say that they are expressive by the mere fact they can use human language. And animals are expressive among themselves because they can use their own language, but they are not expressive to us. And everybody can be fasih. And that's the second quote marked in red on the second line. Everybody can be fasih, even if this person speaks in Farsi, Hindi, or even Latin, right? So to the Arabs of the 3rd and the 4th centuries, there was no preference to a particular language, and there was no prestige to that. However, all through my readings in the literature of the 3rd and the 4th centuries, I have not seen any understanding to the specialization of language, meaning that the language of pre-Islamic poetry and the Qur'an, it was not identified in the literature as limited to a particular communicative function or not. Sources are mute to that point. But one can understand, in fact, that classical Arabic, the pre-classical form was the language of all the Arabs. There was no prestige and there was no hierarchical organization. Now, there are, during the readings, I began to understand that there were two general linguistic concepts governing the linguistic thinking of early Arabs up to the 4th century. And the first one of these was the concept that I transliterated here as lugha. And lugha to the Arab scholar of the 2nd to 4th centuries meant a variant. And the variant can be a whole, can be human language in general, can be a particular language, can be a dialect of a language, can be an idiolect of a person, can be a register of a community, and can also be an individual word, meaning that the Arabs looked at lugha as a very broad spectrum, including the individual word. And in the literature, especially in the early introductions to Arabic linguistics in the 3rd and the 4th centuries, there was no understanding of a dialect like we understand it in our modern linguistic tradition as a group of matrices on the same linguistic level, on different linguistic levels that have co-occurring relationships. No, to Arabs, there was no such understanding. The Arabic language to them was a continuum of lughat, a continuum of individual words and individual variants. And those variants can be used or not by an individual choice. So an individual may choose to use a particular lugha at particular time or not at a different time. He or she is not governed by the structural bounds of their speech community, which sends us to the second concept. It's the concept of selection. Arabs are, at least all through the 4th century, were allowed, in fact, encouraged to select what they thought was the best lugha, the best variant. And in the defense in the 4th century, of the socio-linguistic position that the language of the Prophet, who is from Hijaz, the shaded green part on the earlier map, was the best production of Arabic. In the justification to that, there were two reasons that were given by all these introductions. One, of course, that it is the variety which the Prophet used, and the Prophet is chosen by God, then God does not choose except wisely, and that should be the best. The second reason is more interesting, namely that the Arabs in the Hijaz region, where Mecca was situated, were at an advantage of receiving Arabs from all different kinds of geographical locations, at least once a year. And they were able to select the best forms and adopt them for use, right? So Arabs dealt with the language not in the bounds of dialects, but as a continuum, and also were encouraged to select the best individually or as a group. But the selection, interestingly, the selection was governed in the 4th century by two aspects. One of them is that you are encouraged to select the most commonly used form if you are to choose something, and use the most commonly used form and the one that resembles what grammarians think is best. And we'll come to that in a second. But still, if you decided not to select for use the most common or the most approved by grammarians, you're not missing the mark on what's good Arabic. You're missing the mark on what's best Arabic. But of course, you are entitled to your own selection. That said, it's very interesting when we start looking at Arabic from above from a bird's eye view, because if we start doing that, we'll see that, in fact, the sounds of classical Arabic were selected based on prestige and were selected way earlier than the morphosyntactic features. The morphosyntactic features were selected on the basis of available data, and that's where the Qur'an comes in. And I will start talking about the sounds of Arabic real briefly, because first Van Putten illustrated that very well. But let me run through it really quickly. The sounds of classical Arabic were chosen to be the sounds of the dialect of the Prophet Muhammad. And that selection or choice goes against the grammarian's concepts of selecting what's more common, because the varieties, so the variety the Prophet Muhammad spoke was not the most common variety of Arabic in the 1st century. In fact, if you still remember the map, I should probably go back to it. This map here, on the green part of the map, is the domain or the geographical area, generally speaking, where the Prophet Muhammad lived. And that's his dialect area, if it could be called a dialect. The larger and the certainly much more populated area is the Najd Plateau region, shaded in yellow, where generally speaking, more tribes, more prominent tribes, more densely populated areas spoke varieties that differed in their sound levels from the variety of the Prophet Muhammad. But still, the Prophet's sound features became standardized as best Arabic. And we could see this in the 3rd century because in the books, the commonplace books, and in the books of Majalis, they were always listed as best sound features. And sound features of other dialects were always dubbed as لغات مذمومة, or ugly variants. But in the 3rd and the 4th centuries, those variants that were dubbed ugly variants, لغات مذمومة, were not disused. They were still used in the recitation of the Quran and in public speech. Interestingly, in the 4th century, in the 5th century, the 11th of the Common Era, when the Quran became the most well-studied text and became accepted as the language, as the perfect style of Arabic, that we see all these lughat madhmuma acquire an epithet, lughat mustabsha'a, which is really no use, and they were not used in the recitation of the Quran anymore. So in the books of the 5th century, where the study of Arabic was not based on poetry and the Quran and the speech of the Arabs, but were limited only to the Quran, that we see the correlation between the sound features of the Prophet's dialect and best Arabic to the exclusion of other forms. And I published 3 articles, 2017, 2019, and I think 2020, on 3 of these sound features. If we move to the morphosyntactic features, the situation is a little bit more complicated. I would like to remind everybody that the selection of standardized morphosyntactic features was based on the availability of data. So Arab grammarians from the end of the 2nd century, 8th century of the Common Era, had at their disposal 3 sets of data: pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry, the Quran, and what the Arabs generally called the speech of the Arabs, so native informants. The pre-Islamic poetry and the Quran was used as material for analysis, but the speech of the Arabs was used basically for verification and double checking. So we'll take as our case study here the first Arab grammarian at the end of the 8th century, another Persian Arab linguist from a Persian descent, Sibawayhi, who used 1,056 lines of poetry for analysis versus a little bit over 430 something verses from the Quran. And Sibawayhi's use of pre-Islamic poetry was much more pervasive. Now, in addition to that, Sibawayhi's use of poetry was much more limited to the poets who lived in his vicinity. So I will go back to the map once more, if you allow me to do. I already did. Sorry. So Sibawayhi lived in Basra, which is to the northeast of the Arabian Peninsula, where yellow meets white on your top right part of the map. And he lived there. There is no record of him moving elsewhere on the Arabian Peninsula, or even taking a short trip to the Hajj, for instance. But Sibawayh, he used poets. 44 of his poets were from his immediate vicinity, while others were from the general area that he lived in. And for only 14 poets from the Hijaz region where the prophet's variety was. So that's why the structural features that Sibawayh codified and registered, and after that everybody took from Sibawayh, we're more towards that Northeast Arabian geographical location than to West Arabia, where the Prophet Muhammad lived. So if we take, for instance, one structural feature, that's the last article that I just submitted for publication this year, has to do with إذا, which is the conditional particle if. So إذا in the Arabic tradition before the times of Sibawayh had three distinct meanings. One is a particle of initiative, where a new incident or event happens in the middle of an ongoing event. And the second function is a preposition for the future preposition. And the third function is the conditional function. In the dialect of the Prophet Muhammad, as we see from the Qur'an, the tokens of إذا in the Qur'an lean more towards the conditional function. Almost 2/3 of the tokens lean towards the conditional functions, and the other two functions come second and third. But the material that Sibawayh used from pre-Islamic and early Islamic poetry showed the reverse, where إذا was not used as a conditional function, and where the Arabs surrounding his geographical location also did not use إذا as a conditional function. So his analysis of poetry meets the agreement of his native informants. So that's a difference between the tokens in the Quran and the tokens in pre-Islamic poetry. That is why Sibawayh, in his discussion of conditionals, does not include إذا in his conditional particles, and also does not give it any meaningful study as a structural feature. On the contrary, he goes on to say that using it as a conditional is just simply wrong. It's only functional as such as a poetic license. So the same understanding was current during his time and in the next 2 to 3 centuries of the Islamic era. Again, in the 5th century of the Islamic era, when studying the best style of Arabic became limited to the Quran, or nearly limited to the Quran, the understanding shifted, and it shifted gradually. And if you see al-Jurjani in the 5th century, was the first author to put the Quranic text for analysis as a source of data by the express understanding that through analyzing the Quran, we can devise the best stylistic and grammatical features that we can use for Arabic and mimic the best text, the word of God. And in this, he finds that it's allowable to use إذا, the conditional particle, as such, as a conditional. And interestingly, Al-Jurjani decides that إذا is used as a conditional particle only in the event where the occurrence of the incidence is inevitable, meaning that if the sun comes out, then it will be light. In such contexts, إذا is usable. And that's the most common use of إذا in the Quran. But Sibawayhi's understanding lingered even in the background for a little bit up until the 15th century of the Common Era, where إذا was exclusively considered by Suyuti as the conditional particle for inevitable and even plausible situations. And Sibawayhi's understanding just became only historical. And there is this correlation between the availability of data for analysis and the development of this understanding. So as early as the 4th century of the Islamic era, the sounds of Arabic became, the sounds of the Hijaz region shaded in green on the map became the standardized ones because it's the variety of the prophet that he used in the recitation of Revelation. And as of the 5th century onwards, morphosyntactic structural features became more and more in conformation with the Quran, although in between the 2nd and the 4th century, the Arab grammarians, in fact, differed with the Quran extensively in their grammatical analysis. That difference dwindled along the century until in the 15th century, by the times of Suyuti, this became only dissidence, in meaning that it was not a matter of which best Arabic, whatever the Quran made is correct. And then this is now, this point is still under study. The transition of the use of the word fasih, expressive, began to be felt from the times of Suyuti onwards. So if you've seen in Al-Jahaz earlier, I said fasih meant merely expressive. There was no prestige value. In fact, with the times of Al-Jurjani in the 5th century, and which is the 11th and 12th century of the Common Era, and the 15th century of the Common Era, the word fasih began to acquire prestige because the standardization process was well underway. I am currently reading about different sources about this transition of fasih into a prestigious form. And I will probably be able to present on that in the next talk I give. So to conclude, classical Arabic emerged from an amalgamation from all the dialects of Arabic. And there were two processes involved. One is a sociolinguistic selection by prestige, and the one is is the availability of data. With that, we can in fact put a date on the emergence of classical Arabic way later than the Quran. So we can have this working assumption that pre-Islamic Arabic poetry and the Quran existed as texts first before their language became recognized as such. That said, this, in fact, this conclusion, if it survives the scrutiny of colleagues in the future, is puts the narrative among Semitic scholars into question, that Arabic belongs to a particular Semitic, that classical Arabic belongs to a particular Semitic group, and that it is one of the most ancient Semitic languages. In fact, it's one of the most recent recorded Semitic languages. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Would you like to stop sharing your screen so then we can have a...
Yeah, I was just wondering how to do that.
I think that you can, there's a button up there that should be on your screen that says stop sharing.
Is it red?
It might be, yes.
I think it's next to where the chat is, your final share screen. Yeah, okay.
I think you did, right?
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, you did.
You got it.
Cool.
I'd just like to start off the questions. I know that the linguists will have a lot of questions, but to use my director's privilege to ask a question about the Quran itself as an agent of this amalgamation. You know, there was one point where you said, well, people said, well, we prefer this variant because it's the language of the Quran and that's God's language. And you said, well, that's not very interesting. Let's move on to this other part. I think, but it is interesting to me, you know, that what is the role of religion in, you know, facilitating this process? It's just, it's kind of a fascinating idea to me that, you know, the sacred text will, which is the language of God, right? So it might make sense that it would be a little bit different and the less favored, you know, dialect that people might not know, that could make sense that it's the language of God. I'm just kind of intrigued by this.
Okay. So it was the language of God because it was the language of the Quran and the language of the Prophet Muhammad. That was the narrative in the 3rd century. But also, think about it. It was said, it was framed this way merely because, sorry, among other reasons, because the ruling dynasty at the time belonged to the same clan, the clan belonged to the same city that the Prophet Muhammad did. So I can share with you now a quote from the year 201 in one of the Majalis books, where the first Umayyad Caliph, and that was the year 42 of the Islamic era, the first Umayyad Caliph Muawiyah belonged to the same city of the Prophet, and he was in fact one of the companions of the Prophet. And the quote goes like this. So he asked, what is the most expressive manner of speech among the Arabs? And one of his people in the meeting says, your variety, Prince, because it is the variety in which the Quran was revealed, and it lacks features 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? So yes, the common understanding was that it's the language of the Prophet and the revelation, but it was also conveniently the language of the ruling dynasty in the first 3 centuries of the Islamic era. Yeah, it's quite interesting from a socio-political and sociolinguistic perspective. But if you think about it too, the morphosyntactic features of Arabic did not follow the same pattern. right? So they were usually given, so the selection of morphosyntactic features was that of dialects that the Arabs considered ugly in so far as their sound features were concerned. But those were available to grammarians for analysis.
Thank you.
Yes,
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think Anne's got a question here.
Another non-linguistic person, but I think I know you were working on this like when you were coming up for promotion, and I thought it was like a really interesting project. And I mean, it seems to me what I think is interesting is that the status of the Quran with respect to understanding the Arabic language doesn't get solidified until the 19th century, right?
Until the 15th century, yes. But the spread of the position of the Quran came in the 19th century with the spread of education and the press.
And I was wondering, yeah, because I guess I just think that 19th century, when I think of 19th century, I'm thinking, yeah, like national education, and how does it tie into questions of both nationalism, but also you have the growing tensions with European colonization that can also solidify nationalist. Whereas it seems like earlier there, it might go, the position of the Quran might go up and down depending on who's talking about it, but then we have this moment of this very clear solidification. So I just think it's a really interesting story.
It's really also more interesting that the emergence of classical Arabic into modern standard Arabic and and spreading the position on the Quran and the functions of Arabic came on the hands of non-Muslim, usually missionary Christians in the Levant.
Really interesting.
Yeah. Yes, it is. Very interesting. But luckily enough, it's not my field of study. I can be interested in it innocently. Okay. Other questions?
Yeah. Hello. Thank you so very much for it's very, very interesting, and there's a lot over there. I mean, I feel it's a huge field, and I have some interest in I'm not a linguist, but I'm more of a literature person, and I've done some translations as well. So what you write about brings to mind. I just have a very quick question that will probably require maybe an entire lecture, which would be great. I'm sure you're familiar, of course, with Taha Hussein, and when he wrote earlier about the origin of pre-Islamic poetry. And I'm a fan of one of your books on the development and history and development of Arabic language, and I've used it even in teaching at a certain point. Do you have any, like, maybe quick comment on the implication of, or the impact of your studies on this sort of like literary aspect of maybe the argument that started like by people like Hussein or like something like that? Is there anything that you see where your study can comment? Yeah, can impact that?
The argument by Taha Hussein, which is a very brilliant argument, by the way, has been laid to rest, like all brilliant arguments, in the 30s of the 20th century. And the reason is, statistically speaking, now we have a statistical understanding, and we have a more cultural understanding of the chains of transmissions of these texts. It gives you an analysis that gives you a good feeling that those texts are first authentic, and second, if somebody is or was to sit down and try to forge some of these texts, it is extremely unlikely. And the reason is not the linguistic aspect. In fact, the reason is variation. And because the way pre-Islamic poetry and the way the Quran, to an extent, is especially lexically structured, is that in pre-Islamic poetry, you had the genius of a poet is to formulate a preconceived topic using new words that fit a particular rhyme scheme and a very rigid metric condition. So your genius as a poet is not to create images or novel meanings. Your genius is to box the meanings into different meters and rhyme schemes. That's why pre-Islamic Arab poets, which are culturally different from early Islamic poetry, used vocabulary items from all over the Arabian Peninsula. That's why now you see the richest lexical tradition is the Arabic, because there is so many different words for a particular meaning, right? Okay. And those lexica are taken generally depend generally on pre-Islamic poetry. So if you were to do this forgery, you will need to be very well acquainted with pre-Islamic dialects, so you can use that variation. Okay. Right? That makes that's brilliant. And let me just conclude by a particular. Yeah, sure. It's a very quick comment. If you look generally on so Islamic poetry as of the 2nd century of the Islamic era, the 8th century of the Common Era, it begins to be novel themes, very simple and predictable vocabulary, no strange vocabulary, and very simple rhyme scheme and metric conditions. Right? Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. True. Thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, this is a brilliant study. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for the lecture and for answering my question. Of course. Thank you. Yeah. Of course. Other questions?
Well, we're just now at our time.
I think Natalia had a question.
Natalia, yes. Let's go to Natalia.
Only if there is still time.
Go ahead, Natalia.
Okay. Well, Mohammed, thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I have heard it repeated so many times that standard Arabic is nobody's mother tongue. And so this is just incredible that it probably was never anybody's mother tongue. So thank you for this. And I'm not sure if it's a question or a comment. I've spoken with multiple native speakers of Arabic, and I always wanted to know which colloquial variety of Arabic is closest to the standard Arabic. And I could never get a consistent answer. And so I've heard Levantine Arabic, maybe Iraqi, never Hijazi. Nobody mentioned Hijazi for some reason. But now it makes, I think it makes a lot of sense that, so I was thinking maybe people just they're not sociolinguists and they're not familiar with the varieties. But I think your theory maybe would explain that there is no currently used colloquial form of Arabic that is closest to the classical or standard Arabic. Is that your feeling?
Yes. So think about it this way. Arabic dialects, both on the Arabian Peninsula, birthplace of the language, and in the Middle East and North Africa, are much more ancient than classical Arabic. So look at it the reverse way. Which variety? No. Okay. So what is the variety that classical Arabic comes closest to? If you ask the question this way, we can have some interesting and actually fruitful debates. But both Arab scholars, for traditional and religious reasons, and Western scholars who sometimes are much more conservative than Arab scholars, especially those in the field of Semitic linguistics, tend to be comfortable with the other, with the traditional perspective. But the perspective I'm proposing, in fact, puts classical Arabic closest to, in the sound features, to the dialects of Hijaz and northern Yemen, and in the morphosyntactic features to the northeast peninsular dialects, now southern Iraq, Kuwait, and parts of Bahrain, right? And certain sets of waves of migrations have happened between that geographicalization I just told you and the current times that would blur this perspective, right? So I would say that nobody has a monopoly even on the proximity to classical Arabic. I'll give you an example. Egypt has seen Egypt was Arabized basically by Yemeni and Najdi Arabs in the beginning, but it has seen different waves of migration from the Arabian Peninsula and reverse migrations from North Africa towards the Arabian Peninsula up to the 13th century, right? And in the 19th century, there was a huge influx of the products of this migration from southern Egypt and northern Delta in Egypt to where Cairo is right now, right? So there is no way to be able to determine proximities at all.
Thank you.
I saw that Walter had his hand up. I don't know if he wanted to contribute to that, but I'll give him a chance before we sign off. Walter, you're muted.
Yeah, there was the sociolinguistic elephant in the house, which is the diglossic matter. I mean, you started off talking about all of this within the context of diglossia, and you know that recently that concept of diglossia has become rather porous, and so I wanted to invite you to explicate that. I mean, how does classical Arabic, standard Arabic, and the more prestigious colloquial dialects, how do they participate in this diglossia, if it still holds? Or is the current situation, as you described it, and I mean, there's this sort of dichotomy in my mind between sort of the classical early Arabic situation and the present day status of these. But if there's anything you can say that might clarify the status of that concept of diglossia, either now or in the past. And it could be very quick, or you and I can have lunch. We've not had lunch for a long time.
I would love to have lunch.
There is shields right at the bottom of thing and they have vegetarian stuff that you and I can sit and talk. Okay. But if you wish, you can say something.
Yeah, really quickly, 2 points. First is a methodological point. yes, the concept of diglossia gladly is, as a classical Fergusonian concept of diglossia, is gladly not with us anymore. But if you are in the field of Arabic, Walter, you will know that ghosts never go away. So we are currently, the understanding of the relationship, the historical relationship between varieties of Arabic is Fergusonian. However, the current situation of the Arabic language is not dichotomous. The diglossic understanding is that we are on a continuum. And this understanding is being refined every few years. A lot of contributions from different fields. And the second point is I will not venture to draw a line between the classical situation up to the 19th century and the situation from the 19th century on, because education has taken classical Arabic from functionally limited variety to a widespread variety on the one hand, and modern technology took classical Arabic from a language of writing into a language of speaking. So I'll give you a very quick example for the change. Classical Arabic had case marking, and case marking is a suffix u, a, e, short vowels at the end of nouns. Case marking is not functional anymore in modern standard Arabic. However, case markers continue to exist, but they exist as syllable barriers in spoken Arabic. So you will see in writing no case marking representation, but you will see case marking being used in spoken modern standard Arabic on the news, for instance, right? And when it's used, it doesn't mean you have to use modern standard Arabic case marking, quote unquote, properly, because they're just simply syllable barriers, right? There is a couple of PhD dissertations in the publication phase right now about these features. The situation in pre-Islamic, in up to the 19th century was Fergusonian in essence. The understanding of it was Fergusonian. But the current situation is totally different.
All right, well, clearly there's so much more to discuss. I think we are about 10 minutes past our time, so we should end here with a round of applause for our presenter in this wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
really
Jamie.
great.
Thank you, everybody.
Very, very interesting. So awesome.
Bye.
Thank you so much. This was great. Thank you.
Of course.
And good to see people and new people.
Yeah, Mitchell and Dearborn here. So yeah, thank you.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you guys.
Wonderful.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.